One of the strangest weapons of the Second World War looked so harmless, it seemed like it belonged in a kitchen. In reality, it was designed for sabotage and could turn an ordinary sack of flour into a hidden bomb. During the Second World War, warfare followed a simple and almost unquestioned rule. Danger had to look recognizable. Explosives were supposed to smell like chemicals, inspire alarm, and be hidden in crates, containers, and secret compartments. Every supply officer, every sentry at an inspection post, every counterintelligence man thought in exactly those terms. That was the logic of both the front and the rear. Weapons were identified by shape, by weight, by packaging, by traces of handling. If a shipment looked peaceful, it was allowed to pass. If an object looked domestic, it ceased to be a target of suspicion. War built an entire system of filters, and all of them were trained to detect familiar signs of danger. That is why the idea of disguising an explosive substance as an ordinary food product sounded almost absurd. Not like a clever trick, but like technical nonsense. The more powerful the charge, the harder it was to hide without a trace. The more natural the disguise, the greater the risk that the substance would lose its destructive power along with its dangerous appearance. That was not only how soldiers at checkpoints thought. That was how engineers responsible for reliability thought. That was how officials signing supply papers thought. That was how officers responsible for underground operations behind enemy lines thought. To them, a weapon that looked like food did not sound like a solution. It sounded like a road to disaster. The problem was that covert war demanded the impossible. Partisans and agents did not simply need to receive a charge. They had to carry it through inspections, transport it on roads where any sack might be opened, and avoid exposing themselves before the right moment. Under those conditions, ordinary explosives were too visible, and a visible cargo in occupied territory almost always meant failure. That was the central deadlock. If the substance was made too sensitive, it became dangerous to its own side before any sabotage took place. If it was made too safe, it lost its destructive force. If it was given the familiar appearance of a munition, it would be discovered at the very first inspection. And if it was disguised too well, the question remained whether it could still be called a weapon at all. For command, this was not a game of imagination, but the harsh arithmetic of war. A mistake here meant more than the loss of cargo. It meant a ruined operation, an exposed underground network, arrested couriers, destroyed contacts. In covert war, the price of failure was often higher than in open battle, because one small detail could bring down the entire hidden structure. So for a long time, an almost iron certainty prevailed. A real munition could not be turned into something so ordinary that it would pass enemy inspection like a sack of provisions. The idea felt unnatural to the military, to the bureaucracy, and to people accustomed to trusting only proven instruments of destruction. And then, inside secret American laboratories, a project appeared with an almost domestic name: Aunt Jemima. Behind that harmless shell was an idea that shattered the old rule of war. An explosive was to be made so convincingly disguised as baking mix or flour that the danger vanished from sight before the enemy even had a chance to recognize it. At that point, the story stopped being merely technical. It became an investigation into how military science tried to deceive not only an enemy inspection post, but the age-old logic of war itself. Because if a bomb could look like something from a kitchen, then the old rules of safety no longer worked the way they once had. To understand how such a development appeared at all, you have to look at the man who was given the impossible task. His name was George Bogdan Kistiakowsky. In the early 1940s, he was a little over 40. He was no longer just a scientist with a reputation. He was one of those specialists people turned to when a problem went beyond ordinary engineering. His biography itself resembled a route through the catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century. Born in Eastern Europe, shaped by revolution, war, exile, and scientific ascent, he entered American wartime science not as a sheltered academic theorist. Behind him lay not only formulas and lectures, but a personal understanding of what the collapse of states looked like and what the price of technical superiority could be. By the beginning of the Second World War, Kistiakowsky already held a prominent place among specialists in explosives. He worked in an environment where science was becoming increasingly fused with the state, and where the laboratory was becoming an extension of the battlefield. Here, chemists were expected not to produce abstract discoveries, but solutions that could be turned into weapons fit for covert and direct operations alike. That is why his name appeared where others might have seen only absurdity. Explosives disguised as food sounded almost like a joke. But to Kistiakowsky, such a task was no reason for mockery. It was an engineering problem to be broken down into parts: appearance, stability, transport, concealment, blast power, and the behavior of the substance under real wartime conditions. He worked within a system where the structures of the NDRC, the OSRD, and special projects for the OSS intersected. It was a world of closed doors, brief reports, and decisions rarely discussed aloud. Grand phrases were unwelcome there. Only one question mattered. Could a device be created that would pass through enemy control and work when the moment truly came? At first glance, the task sounded simple. It was necessary to create an explosive substance that resembled flour or dry baking mix. But behind that simplicity hid an almost impossible combination of demands. The compound had to be safe enough for covert transport. It could not betray itself by smell, color, or texture. And at the same time, it had to retain real destructive power. Kistiakowsky found himself at the center of this story for another reason as well. The time demanded exactly such people. Ordinary military tools were effective at the front, where divisions, artillery, tanks, and aircraft operated. But where war was fought through couriers, agent networks, depots, bridges, and solitary acts of sabotage, entirely different instruments were needed. Not the loudest, not the largest, the most invisible. American leadership was increasingly aware that the war could not be won by direct clashes between armies alone. Enemy communications had to be disrupted. Logistics had to be hit. Allied resistance movements had to be supplied with concealed means of attack, especially in territories controlled by Japan, where any cargo inspection could end in arrest or execution. That meant a weapon had to pass where weapons did not pass. And that was exactly the task placed before Kistiakowsky. Not to invent yet another charge for ammunition depots, not to improve a standard detonator. He had to create a substance for covert war in China, for conditions in which a dangerous object had to appear harmless. In essence, this was not simply a new explosive. It was a new form of military concealment brought down to the chemical level. This work did not exist in isolation. It was born at the intersection of laboratory science and political calculation. Chinese resistance forces, partisans, agents, transporters, clandestine routes. All of this required a means that could be hidden among the most ordinary cargoes. Flour, baking mix, provisions, household goods. Anything that did not instantly make a guard suspicious. But it was exactly here that Kistiakowsky faced his main professional challenge. An explosive substance could not simply be recolored and renamed. It had to be made so similar to an innocent powder that it deceived not only the eye, but the very logic of inspection. The inspector had to see not a weapon, but something so ordinary that suspicion would move right past it without lingering for even a second. And yet, even for an experienced specialist, this was a task on the edge of absurdity. A compound that was too powerful increased the risk of accidental discovery and danger during transport. A compound that was too cautious turned the entire enterprise into a useless experiment. Between those extremes, Kistiakowsky had to find a point of balance, not a theoretical one, a real one. One that could survive the road, the courier's hands, the hiding place, the humidity, time, and the moment of use. That is why Kistiakowsky's role in this story matters not as a biographical aside, but as the key to understanding the entire project. Without a man of his caliber, the idea of Aunt Jemima would probably have remained on paper as a strange proposal. But in the hands of an explosives specialist, it began to turn into a development that people were willing to take seriously, despite all of its outward absurdity. Later, his name would emerge in even darker and more famous contexts of wartime history. He would become connected to the Manhattan Project and to work that defined another era of war, the nuclear age. But here, at the beginning of this story, a different task stood before him. Not the largest in terms of consequences, but one of the strangest in conception. To make a weapon look like food, and to make suspicion itself look like a mistake. By the time the Aunt Jemima project appeared, the United States was already fighting not only with armies, fleets, and aircraft. In parallel, another system was being built, one far less visible. This was a war of hidden routes, agent connections, secret deliveries, and sabotage, where success depended not on the sheer weight of the blow, but on the ability to reach the target unnoticed. Here, the OSS came to the foreground, an organization created for tasks that could not be solved by ordinary military means. Its concern was not only intelligence, but sabotage, support for resistance, and covert operations behind enemy-controlled lines. For that kind of war, brave men alone were not enough. What was needed were tools able to dissolve into the ordinary world around them. The problem became especially acute in the Asian theater, above all in China. Vast spaces, broken communications, areas under Japanese control, roads, crossings, depots, and stations formed the nervous system of occupation. A strike against that system could be extremely painful. But first, one had to reach it, and that was an entirely different problem. Here, ordinary explosives often lost even before an operation began. They were too difficult to carry through inspection. Their appearance was too eloquent. Any suspicious cargo could be halted, opened, and confiscated. Along with it could disappear a courier, a contact, an underground cell, and sometimes an entire network that had taken months or years to build. That is why the center of the design was not the explosion itself, but the moment before it. A means had to be invented that did not betray itself in advance, a means capable of passing through occupied territory as though there were nothing military about it at all. For covert war, that was almost an ideal weapon. Not the one that struck hardest, but the one that reached the target without provoking a second glance. In that sense, Aunt Jemima was born not as an eccentric laboratory whim, but as a direct answer to a practical problem. If agents and allied underground groups needed a sabotage tool, yet ordinary charges were too conspicuous, then another form of concealment had to be found. Not to hide the weapon inside the cargo, but to make the cargo itself appear entirely non-military. The idea itself seemed almost provocative. Not a container with a false bottom, not a carefully altered crate, not a hidden compartment in a convoy, but a powder resembling flour or dry baking mix. So ordinary in appearance that it ceased to be an object of military suspicion. That was exactly what made the project so unusual. It attacked not a fortification, but the enemy's habit of recognizing danger. Within the American system of covert war, such projects did not arise in a vacuum. The OSS needed tools that could be passed to partisans and resistance groups under conditions of constant danger. The OSRD and related research structures provided the scientific base for that effort. And so an alliance formed between intelligence, sabotage, and laboratory thought, in which every successful development could alter the very technique of underground struggle. But between idea and use lay a long chain of trials and doubts. Any disguise is effective only until its first serious encounter with reality. Powder might behave differently in storage. It might react to humidity, time, packaging, or jolting during transport. It might seem unnatural in the hands of someone accustomed to handling provisions. In covert war, that alone was enough to ruin an operation. That is why preparing such a device for use was not a romantic tale of a clever trick, but harsh work at the edge of science and risk. It was necessary to ensure that the substance looked harmless, could be transported reliably enough, and yet did not lose its military purpose. Otherwise, the whole structure would collapse. Either the disguise would fail, or the weapon itself would prove useless. For the OSS, the stakes were especially high. If Aunt Jemima failed to justify expectations, the damage would be broader than the failure of a single project. The entire idea of unconventional special devices would come under suspicion. Military command, already demanding reliability and practical usefulness, could easily see such developments as dangerous eccentricities unfit for real war. And covert war does not forgive the loss of trust. In China, where such solutions were expected to be used, the price of error was even higher. There, sabotage was not separated from civilian life by any stable front line. Every cargo moved through a space of suspicion. Any man with a sack over his shoulder could find himself before a patrol demanding to know what he carried. And if a weapon could not be hidden in such a world, then it could scarcely be delivered to the target at all. That is why preparing the appearance of Aunt Jemima was not only a chemical problem, but a logistical one. It was necessary to understand how such a substance would look in the actual movement of war, how to package it, how to transfer it, how not to attract attention too soon. A covert operation here began long before the blast. It began the instant someone decided that this particular sack did not deserve inspection. At first glance, there was something almost absurd about such a design. But in covert war, absurdity often becomes a tool. What seems too ridiculous to be true sometimes works best of all. The enemy looks for familiar threats. He is trained to notice the shape of a weapon, its weight, its packaging, its smell. He thinks according to the laws of ordinary war, which means that where the domestic begins, his attention weakens. Yet the project required more than the participation of intelligence officers and scientists. It implied the existence of an entire chain that would one day carry the substance forward, from the laboratory to the field of use. Between the American development and the Chinese resistance lay an abyss of distance, risk, and organizational complexity. And every link in that chain had to withstand the test of invisibility, or the value of the invention would vanish. That is where the tension grows. Nothing has exploded yet. There is no final moment of sabotage. There is only preparation, in which it is decided whether Aunt Jemima will become a real weapon or remain a strange line in closed files. Everything depends on whether the impossible can be reconciled. A domestic appearance, reliable transport, hidden use, and real destructive capability. But it is precisely here, at the very core of the plan, that the crisis begins. A project that looks like an elegant solution on paper becomes, in reality, an almost unmanageable contradiction. The substance must be harmless enough in appearance not to arouse suspicion, and destructive enough not to turn into an empty trick. For ordinary explosives, suspiciousness is almost a natural quality. They are stored separately, transported carefully, marked as dangerous cargo, and kept apart from everyday items. Aunt Jemima required the opposite. It had to be made not merely hidden, but plausible. And plausibility became the hardest test of all. Every small detail started working against the developers. The color could not seem alarming. The consistency could not appear strange. The packaging had to look familiar. Even the very idea of handling such a substance broke standard rules. What normally increased the safety of military cargo could, in this case, destroy the disguise before it ever left the storage room. The crisis also lay in the fact that chemistry in this story could not be separated from psychology. It was not enough to create a compound that outwardly resembled flour. The man at the inspection post had to believe in that flour before he had time to activate suspicion, and that meant a struggle not only with the substance itself, but with the enemy's logic. Trained to recognize danger through familiar signs. With every new attempt, an unpleasant truth became clearer. The better the disguise, the greater the danger of losing military effectiveness. The more convincingly the substance behaved like a weapon, the harder it became to hide it in the form of an innocent product. The project was squeezed between two extremes, and each of them was fatal to the design. Either the disguise would fail, or the purpose of the sabotage would disappear. That is why doubt began to enter not only the calculations, but attitudes toward the project itself. To some military clients, the idea was already too fragile to trust in real operations. They wanted straightforward reliability from a sabotage device, a solid charge, a clear method of use, an understandable force. But here, everything depended on something being taken for what it was not. To men accustomed to rigid military logic, this was almost offensive. War demanded clarity, and here ambiguity was being proposed. War demanded control, and here control itself became part of the problem. The more carefully and strictly the substance was handled, the greater the chance that its behavior would reveal its artificiality. The more naturally it was handled, the greater the danger to those nearby. At this stage, the development itself began to resemble walking a narrow plank over an abyss. On one side lay technical failure, on the other, operational catastrophe. If such a device proved unstable, it threatened its own side before use. If it proved too weak, the entire project would be reduced to an elaborate deception, useless against real targets of war. And this was no abstract fear. Where weapons are passed along underground routes, an error does not remain a laboratory error. It becomes human immediately. A courier carrying suspicious cargo might die. A contact in whose possession something strange is found could lead the enemy to the whole network. In covert war, failure is rarely confined to a single point. That is why the crisis of Aunt Jemima was also a crisis of trust. Not only chemists had to be convinced, but also the men who would decide whether to use it. And that was harder than creating the substance itself. It was not enough for the military to hear that the compound was unusual. They had to know it could be carried through, that it would not ruin the operation by its very nature, that it would work when a result was demanded of it. Against that background, the entire concept began to seem nearly insane even to those involved in it. In ordinary war, a weapon must be a weapon not only by effect, but by appearance, by storage method, by logic of use. Here, everything was reversed. The substance had to mimic civilian life so convincingly that the war inside it remained invisible until the final moment. That is what made the position feel almost hopeless. The enemy searched for danger through signs that had been considered unquestionable for decades. To pass by his control, those signs had to be abandoned. But once the developer abandoned the familiar signs of explosives, he risked abandoning their essence as well. The project began to struggle against the very nature of military substances. And there was another pressure as well. Time. Covert war could not wait forever for a perfect answer. The Japanese occupation system was not standing still. Communications continued to function. Roads, bridges, depots, and supply routes kept feeding the enemy machine. While the laboratory searched for balance between disguise and force, war demanded results and demanded them as quickly as possible. At that stage, Aunt Jemima could no longer be dismissed as a curious invention. On the contrary, its strangeness began to look frightening. The more closely one examined the design, the clearer it became that it could either open a new direction in covert war or become an example of dangerous self-deception. And the closer the project came to practical meaning, the stronger the sense that failure was almost inevitable. Because the logic of failure here was too convincing. If the enemy noticed the mismatch, the cargo would be opened. If the compound behaved unstably, no one would dare use it. If the destructive effect proved insufficient, command would draw the obvious conclusion. The idea had been too clever for its own good. In such a framework, almost any outcome except a perfect one led toward failure. And yet the greatest danger turned out to be not the risk posed by the enemy, but the risk posed by the idea itself. At a certain point, it became clear that the project might die not from a Japanese inspection post and not from field use, but from internal mistrust. It could be stopped before it ever proved its value. Not because it was certain not to work, but because it contradicted military common sense too sharply. That is why the crisis reached its true depth not in the moment of an explosion or a delivery, but here in the phase of doubt, when the project was real enough to frighten and not yet proven enough to persuade. Aunt Jemima balanced between archival oddity and military necessity. One step to either side, and the whole story would end before it had truly begun. And yet it was exactly when the project seemed to have reached the limits of its own absurdity that the turning point arrived. The solution was sought no longer in hiding a finished weapon among peaceful cargoes, but in a different logic altogether. The substance itself had to look harmless from the beginning, not disguise layered over essence, but essence concealed inside ordinary form. That is what made Aunt Jemima a genuinely dangerous idea. An ordinary hiding place can be discovered. A false bottom can be pried open. Fake packaging can arouse suspicion. But if destructive force is contained in something that looks like the most ordinary baking mix, then the normal logic of inspection begins to fail. The enemy looks for weapons, while before him lies something too mundane to provoke alarm. At that point, the very philosophy of sabotage changes. Previously, people tried to make a weapon invisible while still allowing it to remain, recognizably, a weapon. Now the weapon had to be perceived as something belonging to a completely different, peaceful category. The substance had to pass, not because it was poorly noticed, but because it was never considered a threat at all. That was no longer simple concealment. It was deception at the level of danger recognition itself. Here the project ceased to be the victim of its own contradictions and turned that contradiction into an advantage. Everything that had once looked like weakness now began to work in its favor. A harmless outward appearance was no longer seen as a compromise. It became the main weapon. Concealment stopped being an addition to the charge. It became part of the charge's destructive power. From that came a new principle of covert war. It was no longer necessary to carry toward a target an object resembling a bomb. It was enough to deliver something that did not resemble a bomb at all. That made the project especially valuable to underground networks and to operations under rigid control. The more familiar the cargo looked, the more calmly it passed through the zone of suspicion without provoking the decisive question. This story also depends on what the enemy looks like. The Japanese occupation machine was strong in discipline, inspections, a regime of control, and attention to recognizable signs of threat. It knew how to look for rifles, detonators, metal parts, suspicious containers, and strange transport patterns, but that was also where its weakness lay. It relied too heavily on known forms of danger and was less able to recognize what did not fit the pattern. When a system is trained on familiar danger, the ordinary becomes its blind spot. That is where the true meaning of Aunt Jemima emerges. Not in the fact that it was an unusual explosive in itself, but in the fact that it turned the enemy's own confidence against him. The sentry believes in the obviousness of inspection. The officer believes in the recognizability of weapons. Control believes in its own rules, and that is exactly why it loses. From that moment, covert sabotage acquired a new dimension. Its success depended not only on the power of the substance and not only on the skill of the operative. It depended on how convincingly the weapon could play the role of a civilian object. War moved beyond metal, fire, and blast. It entered the domain of habits, expectations, and domestic categories that structured life in occupied territory. That is why Aunt Jemima cannot be treated as a curious episode of military ingenuity. It is a symptom of a much deeper process. During the Second World War, science began to create not merely stronger weapons, but cleverer ones. Not only shells that could strike farther, but substances that could pass closer. Not only munitions that destroyed a target, but objects that first destroyed the enemy's confidence in his own control. For the OSS, that change mattered especially. The organization received not simply another means of sabotage, but proof that everyday life itself could be turned into an instrument of operation. That widened the boundaries of the possible. If sabotage had once required hiding a combat device, it could now begin with an object concealed not in a secret compartment, but in its own plausibility. That also changed the significance of logistics. Previously, the most vulnerable point in an underground operation often lay in transport. That was where the weapon might be discovered. Now there emerged a chance to pass through that stage with far less risk, because danger no longer looked dangerous. In covert war, that was almost a revolution. To deliver the charge to the target meant winning half the operation before its active phase even began. And yet, there was a dark tone to that victory as well. Aunt Jemima showed just how far war had gone in destroying the boundary between the peaceful and the military. If flour could become a shell for sabotage, then everyday space itself was no longer protected by its innocence. Kitchen imagery, household powder, an ordinary sack, all of it could now become part of the hidden front. That is the true dramatic turn of the story. At the beginning, it seemed that danger had to wear a recognizable face. Now it became clear that the rule could indeed be broken, not by force, not by frontal assault, but by the precise use of what the enemy considered too familiar to be deadly serious. From then on, the weapon was not only the charge, but its legend. Not only the substance, but the story the enemy involuntarily told himself when looking at a sack of powder. He saw provisions, raw material, household cargo, something dull and harmless. And at that very moment, the sabotage had already begun to work. Not after the explosion, but earlier, when control relaxed and allowed the threat to pass through its own filters. The appearance of Aunt Jemima did not reverse the war with a single blow, nor did it become some wonder weapon dreamed of by headquarters. Its significance lay elsewhere. It showed how far the Allies were prepared to go in searching for means of covert sabotage. War was no longer confined to artillery, air raids, and standard charges. It was moving ever deeper into the realm of disguise and invisible penetration. That is especially important for understanding the logic of the OSS itself. The organization was not created for spectacular operations in plain sight, but for instruments that acted quietly while changing the situation from within. Aunt Jemima became part of exactly that approach. It was not supposed to impress by appearance. Its value lay in the fact that it could destroy a target while remaining outside suspicion for as long as possible. For underground movements and resistance forces, that principle had almost strategic significance. If a cargo could be carried through a zone of control without immediate exposure, then new possibilities emerged for sabotage against depots, bridges, supply lines, and other vulnerable points in the occupation system. It was not always necessary to have much weaponry. Sometimes it was enough to have something that was not perceived as a weapon at all. That was the main military conclusion. Concealment turned out not to be an accessory to force, but part of force itself. Before that, weapons had mostly been hidden from sight. Now they were being hidden from the very logic of recognition. That changed the rules of the game. In covert war, victory belonged not only to the side with the stronger charge, but to the side that better understood which things the enemy considered safe by definition. For American command, such a development meant a great deal. It confirmed that unconventional means of sabotage could bring practical value and deserved serious attention. Where some military men might have seen only dangerous eccentricity, proof of another sort appeared. Laboratory ingenuity need not distract from war. It could become one of its most subtle and effective instruments. That is why such projects did not disappear into the shadows as curiosities. On the contrary, they became part of a broader process in which science was turning into a central force of modern war. Chemists, engineers, and explosive specialists were no longer working only for abstract progress or even only for industry. They were becoming part of an apparatus that created new forms of pressure on the enemy. Sometimes invisible, but no less dangerous for that. The story of Aunt Jemima is also important because it shows the internal maturation of the OSS itself. The organization learned to think not only in categories of intelligence reporting or subversive propaganda, but in categories of specially constructed weapons for covert war. In that sense, the project stood at the intersection of two worlds: the world of laboratory scientists and the world of agents, couriers, and underground operatives living under constant risk of exposure. Such a synthesis became one of the defining features of the later war. Mass production and frontline firepower remained decisive factors, but alongside them, precision interference in vulnerable points of the enemy system grew increasingly important. It was not always necessary to unleash a huge blow if supply could be quietly disrupted. A crossing put out of action or a break introduced into a system sustained by discipline and repetition. In that sense, Aunt Jemima functioned as a sign of its time. It spoke of a war that had become not only total, but inventive to an alarming degree. The Allies searched for ways to win not only through numbers and firepower, but through the ability to deceive the enemy's expectations. If the enemy was convinced that danger had to wear a familiar form, then the strike had to be hidden precisely where old rules would fail to recognize it. Command saw special value in such an approach. Destroying the target mattered, but no less important was the fact that such a device could pass through filters of control that defeated ordinary charges. In closed systems of occupation, that advantage is hard to overstate. War is won not only on the front line, but in the ability to deliver a blow to places where the enemy feels protected from surprise. Later materials confirmed that Aunt Jemima was not regarded as an empty wartime oddity. It appears in retrospective descriptions of special developments as a characteristic example of a genuinely secret sabotage device. That matters in itself. It means that even after the war, it was remembered not as a joke, but as one of the signs of what the hidden side of the global conflict had really become. And yet its consequences cannot be measured only by practical usefulness. Aunt Jemima also altered the very idea of the boundary between the peaceful and the military. If an explosive could look like baking mix, then everyday life itself was no longer neutral. Ordinary cargo, a sack of powder, an object from the world of kitchens, all of it in this new war could carry a concealed strike within. That made the conflict deeper and darker than it appeared on the surface. In strategic terms, the project did not turn the war by itself, but it expanded the arsenal of covert influence. And that is sometimes no less important than creating another artillery model or aircraft. It proved that sabotage could be made not only bold, but intellectually refined, and that in the modern stage of war, victory does not always belong to the side that makes the most noise, but to the one that can quietly penetrate the very fabric of the enemy order. After this story, George Kistiakowsky did not vanish into the shadows of secondary wartime episodes. On the contrary, his path led even deeper into the most secret part of American wartime science. In 1944, he was drawn into the Manhattan Project, where he directed work on explosive systems at Los Alamos. That was another scale of secrecy, another level of destructive power, and another historical threshold. Thus, the fate of the man who helped solve the problem of explosives disguised as flour became joined to the project that changed the entire 20th century. There is a dark logic to that era. War quickly learned to value those capable of making the impossible technically possible. And if yesterday a scientist had been tasked with hiding a charge inside ordinary life, today a path opened before him toward a weapon of an altogether different order. After the war, Kistiakowsky returned to the academic world, worked at Harvard, and continued his scientific career. Later, he became a special assistant to President Eisenhower for science and technology. But in his biography, there remained forever that special wartime trace. the trace of a man who had worked where chemistry, state secrecy, and covert war converged into one almost invisible line. The story of Aunt Jemima itself faded into shadow after 1945. The OSS was dissolved. Many operations, documents, and technical projects remained outside public memory for a long time. Against the backdrop of enormous battles, bombing campaigns, tank breakthroughs, and the nuclear ending of the war, such developments seemed almost to dissolve. They were too strange, too secret, and too inconvenient for a simple, heroic version of the past. That is why Aunt Jemima long seemed almost like an archival mirage. Not a widely known fact, but a fragment of a parallel war that unfolded beside the Great Chronicle and rarely entered it. A war of laboratories, intelligence services, code names, and operations, where what mattered was not only firepower, but the ability to hide that firepower inside the most ordinary object. But over time, something greater than a mere curiosity begins to emerge from this forgotten episode. It shows how radically the Second World War altered the very concept of a weapon. Danger no longer had to wear a threatening appearance. It could be dry, domestic, almost household in form. And that made it all the more disturbing. War had learned to hide itself inside what had once seemed neutral. Today, this story matters not only as a rare episode from the past of the OSS. It also points to a broader and more unsettling conclusion. The more complex war becomes, the more often its instruments strive to look harmless. The boundary between a peaceful object and a military means begins to blur. And where a person sees ordinary life, the hidden logic of conflict may already be preparing a blow. That is the true legacy of Aunt Jemima. Not in the scale of destruction, but in the scale of the idea. It shows how science, intelligence, and war learn to turn ordinary things into cover for violence. The story begins in near absurdity, but it ends with a very serious conclusion. Sometimes the strangest projects of the past explain best just how inventive, hidden, and frightening the Second World War really was.